thanks so much for being on the podcast. I was just re-looking at your book, The Next Big Asian Brands. How did you decide which brands to feature in your books?
That was one of the biggest hurdles because the idea was not to look at the typical brands that every book and every broadcast and every podcast is looking at, right? Not the usual suspects, if you want. So I wanted to find the brands that are not there yet, that are up and coming. But then, of course, up and coming, not everybody would know about them. I wouldn't know about them. So how do you find them? So I had to rely on other people in those markets in Asia, pretty much in all markets in Asia. So I sat down and I thought about, okay, who do I know? In some markets, these were former colleagues, like in China, like in Indonesia. In some markets, they were former students because as I'm also teaching, and I've been teaching for a while. So some of my students have gone back to their original countries and they're back in Vietnam and back in Korea. I worked in Korea, so I had a few more people there to talk to. And I asked every single one of them, give me a list of the brands in your country that you think have the potential to make it big. So everybody gave me a long list from 20 markets. And then I went through the list and kind of reduced the list according to brands that I thought were interesting or segments that were interesting. So from food to delivery to edutech, whatever. And then, of course, I got in touch with them and asked them, would you want to work with me? And then some of them didn't reply. Some of them said, yeah, maybe now's not a good time because we're doing other things. Some of them said, oh, yes, but it's going to take 6 months to answer your question, like the Japanese, for example. So I ended up with the ones in a way by default, but they were part of a kind of selection, if you want. And then they also had to be willing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that you went beyond, like you said, the big household names, because there's tons of companies and books focusing on the Singapore Airlines and the Grabs. And I talk about that in my class as well, too. But I think I'm very similar to you. I'm always trying to find those hidden gems, those companies that are not quite there. And I like that you've focused on that in the book. And then, like you said, you've tapped your network across the different markets to have them weigh in on the companies that they think are going to be big as well, too. Yeah, I love it. And I love how you incorporated different industries. You mentioned delivery and edutech and things like that. I'm curious, with so many different industries and obviously people from different markets, was there a common thread that you saw from any of these companies that led to some of their growth?
Apart from the fact that they're up and coming, obviously I look for a bit of a range. I wouldn't want to take only tech companies or only food companies and then I think it's also a little bit dependent on in the initial discussions that we had, what they told me about any kind of pivoting or any learnings that they've had from COVID, because this is positioned. So my last book came out just before COVID. So I couldn't travel, I couldn't promote it. And that was about the experience economy. So suddenly we had no more experiences, right? All our experiences were online. And so then I had time and I thought about what I want to do. So obviously this is written as a kind of ending throws post-COVID brand positioning. And so there had to be a part of that message. There had to be some kind of learning. If everything was the same afterwards as it was before, then maybe I'm not so interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the questions I noticed were about them pivoting during COVID. Do you think even post-COVID that a lot of the lessons they spoke about are still relevant now that things are starting to open up and, for example, physical events and activities are starting to become more popular, especially end of this year?
Absolutely. For a long time, remember in the first months or so, I don't know where you were, I was in Singapore, and so a good place to be. So we only had 10 weeks of pretty solid lockdown. And then one of the questions that everybody was asking, not just here, was, what's going to be the new normal? And everybody was having some ideas about it. It'll be very different, and we will not work in offices anymore, and all of those things, right? And it turned out that in many of those physical aspects, the new normal tends to look a little bit like the old normal, right? With some changes here and there. But I do think what the whole pandemic did, it pushed and accelerated some trends that were already happening, that are happening much more now and will continue. So, of course, one of them is digitization. Before that, we already had that. Brands were going digital, but suddenly it wasn't a choice. And it wasn't something they think, yeah, maybe next year I'll think about it. For now, I just have my website or maybe do a little bit of e-commerce. Now they had to do it. And overnight they had to learn how to do it. And I think that's something that will definitely stay with us. However, with the downside or upside, however you want to call it, that this puts the physical, the brick and mortar retail into a difficult but also interesting position. We're thinking about, okay, we also need to change because we need to think about what can we do differently that people will still come, right? Because before that, they were doing okay. They weren't pushed that hard to really change, but now they are. Recently, I was talking to somebody about the Great Singapore Sale. And when I first came here 20 years ago, it was a huge deal. People traveled to Singapore for that. And now this year, nobody noticed. It happened and they put it together with the Formula One night race, but nobody noticed. Why? Because it wasn't special. Because we have the 7788991010 sales online. My advice was they should think about, is there anything that we can do in our shops that nobody can do online? So from fashion shows to food tasting to some event happening, things that the physical world can offer us that the digital world cannot copy. So those trends, I think, are continuing. Health is a huge trend and will continue to be huge. And some of my brands also kind of pivoted or even took some learnings out of that. So I think that's some of the changes that we have seen post-COVID that will continue and are here to stay.
Yeah, it's kind of like a pendulum where you have, obviously during COVID, it's all digital. And now they're trying to get people back into the malls and retail outlets. So I love the idea of trying to think about what are some of the ways that the things you cannot do online, like you said, like fashion shows and food tastings and just the experience. Because I think a lot of people post-COVID are now looking to meet up with people over coffee or just that maybe miss that face-to-face. And I think that's why you see events. So I was talking to a buddy of mine who has the events industry, and his is just like this year.
Exactly. And part of it is revenge events and revenge travel and all of that. But I also think there's a need for those kind of face-to-face encounters. It's just that everybody has to think a little bit harder. And actually, they could also see that pre-pandemic. It's just that they weren't so hard pressed to change. So in my previous book, when I talked about experiences, I also talked about the brick and mortar experience and what they need to do differently. And even then I spoke about local brand like Bind Artisan, where you can get your notebooks put together and little leather personalized, and somebody does it in the shop. So there's this artisan, this uncle who puts it together in front of you. So it's super Instagrammable. Something is happening. And these are the kind of experiences that we need to create, I think now more than ever, because people have learned that actually, do I really need to go out? So we need to work harder.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask a question on behalf of all the regional marketers, because you covered markets everywhere across APAC. Is there one thing that you learned that regional marketers, whether doing Southeast Asia or APAC, can apply to, say, their regional marketing or commercial growth?
In line with what I just said, I think there's a tendency to stay digital because it's easier in a way, it's cheaper, definitely. And of course, I've always become, because I came from this world, right, having been around for 100 years, there's a tendency that they say, okay, we can do it all digital and everything. And one person in my book, Jay Lim, who does Go Pizza out of Korea, said in our discussion, which was really interesting, because he could have done, and he had to do this whole business basically on delivery platforms, right? Because he just opened it and then the pandemic came and everything. And he said, I didn't want to do that because it is almost impossible for people to experience my brand if it just exists in some cloud kitchen. I think that's what he said. And then it's just being delivered on some kind of platform. It becomes very generic in a way. So I wanted to have some places where you can go, where you can see the colors, where you can smell the food as it is being prepared, where you can sit down and enjoy the pizza, in this case, with the friends and everything. And I thought that was interesting, that brands should probably see how they can apply this terrible word, phygital, to their business and make sure that their target group can experience the brand on top of the e-commerce platforms that they're active at.
Yeah, I know that's very imperative for B2C brands. So, for example, if you sell pizza or cosmetics and things like that, you want to try it and or you want to experience it. I'm curious from a B2B point of view, do you still feel like phygital, whatever we're going to call it, is still applicable to go in person and still experience the brand, even if it's, say, a cloud computing software program or something like that?
Absolutely. I think even more because B2C, if you know what the brand is all about, you can probably go out and find a good offer and then you create the kind of brand experience in your house, right? But B2B, what is B2B all about? B2B is all about relationships, right? So it's not just about the product that they're selling or the software or the tech. It's about the relationship because the relationship allows you to be different. Right. I recently spoke to a B2B client and they said, yeah, but our product is industrial and it's like a commodity, right? And there's a price war going on and it's every cent counts. We have to be on the same level as the competition. So we're basically the same. So how can we be different? How can we differentiate the brand and convince people to come with us if the price is not an option that we can play with? And I said, think about service, right? Think about what can you offer in addition to the product, whether it's low tech or high tech, that will create a little bit of peace of mind and will make people return to you in case there's something wrong or it needs some attention. And so I think if anything in a B2B environment, it's about those human relationships. So the personal contact, the kind of sales team that comes to your office and tells you all about the solution that they have for you. A lot of the decision is made, of course, price matters and quality matters and everything, but a lot of the decision is made on the basis of, do I like these people? Do I trust these people? Do I want to work with them for a long time? And I think that's something that sending over a deck by email is probably not going to cut it.
I absolutely agree. I think it's one of the things that we forget in B2B marketing is people not only buy the product, but they also buy the people or the team behind that product. And like you said, if you're able to offer some additional service, I know we were working on a project recently with a B2B commodity company, and one of the things that they did quite well was educate their customers and partners on new ideas on how to get more out of their products. Because when you think with the recession looming, people are more conservative. And so they said, okay, here's some new ideas that you may not have thought about in leveraging this existing products. Obviously, that goes leaps and bounds in terms of building that relationship, because if you can teach me on how to get the most out of something I already have, then, it's a huge opportunity for me. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you there.
Yeah. And another thing you just said, people are becoming a little bit more conservative companies as well as individuals because of recession and inflation and all of that. You don't know what's going on. I think that's true. And what does that mean for brands? And I think one learning that we see is that something like good old-fashioned quality becomes important again, because suddenly you had this experience that during the pandemic, something broke, you cannot replace it. You cannot have it repaired because all the shops are closed. So you don't even think about it, but you realize after a while that, actually it makes sense to invest a little bit more into something that is of a more kind of lasting and better quality, because in the long run, that could actually be a better investment and more value for the kind of money that you're spending. So quality, even though people are price sensitive, but it's that combination, right? How much is it? And then how quickly do I need to replace it? And then if you look at it in the long run, it actually makes sense to invest in quality. So things that we've seen for a while, especially pre-pandemic, things like fast fashion, I think will struggle in the future, because not just because of the quality aspect, but also because now we're asking all those questions, or the Gen Zs are asking all those questions about, where does it come from? How do you treat your people? How about the environment? How about your sourcing and all of that? And so I think it's an interesting and in a way encouraging trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I see the same thing with my students as well, too. One thing you mentioned is extra clients focusing more on quality. I'm curious, because you focus on a lot of young, up-and-coming, emerging brands, how do they compete with the incumbents? Because usually when you think of quality, you think of the big brands. There's that old saying, no one got fired from buying IBM. And so it still carries in a lot of different industries. What's your advice in some of the new brands that are up-and-coming, but maybe not a household name yet?
Okay. I think it still holds true, unfortunately, that many decisions are being made to be safe. And that in many bigger companies, you also see that in government. So whenever I've unfortunately been in some government pitches, and it's always the big names that win because it's a safe decision, right? And then if something goes wrong, I went with the big established name, you cannot blame me, right? So civil servant mentality. And so it's tough if you're the new one. So obviously you need to think about what do I do and how can this be relevant to maybe a changed consumer mindset? Because obviously you can decide and you can pivot much more easily than bigger established brands. And secondly, it's about differentiation, right? Why are you different? How are you different? Can you do something that maybe others are already doing, but do it in a different way? That maybe after a year or two, they may copy you, okay? And then maybe if you cannot copyright that idea, then you need to think of something else. But for the time being, so for me, a good example in the book was Curly, which is this Korean grocery delivery brand. So we know many grocery, we have Red Mart here, and we have many grocery delivery brands. And but when I spoke to them, they told me, no, it came out of the realization that people want good quality. They want fresh and clean food now more than ever. And okay, what does that mean? That means we need to source it directly from the farms. In Korea, that's a little bit easier than in Singapore. And get it from there in the afternoon as soon as the order comes in. And then the second thing, they've been thinking about, okay, how about delivery? Because normally one of the pet peeves that we all have with any delivery is they don't give you proper windows, right? They give you a huge wall of glass, and anywhere within this kind of big opening, they may deliver, right? Some actually tell you between 9 and 5. What kind of window is that? That's a day, right? And so it's difficult, right? Because you have singles, not everybody is at home. So they thought about, okay, if that is the case, and some people may go back to work, some people may still stay at home, but some people may go back, then how do we negotiate that? And then they made an effort, and based on that, made the promise to deliver by 7 a.m. the next morning, which is unheard of, right? You order now in the afternoon sometime, and then they source it from the farm and they bring it to you. Obviously, they have to have a logistical setup, and it works in a place like Korea. Maybe will it work in Indonesia or even China? It's probably difficult. But I thought it was the thinking behind it was interesting. And of course, the problem with that is, and 2 weeks ago I was in the Philippines, I spoke to Rico Hiza on CNN, and he asked me the question, he said, oh, will we see that brand, or will the bigger brands just learn from it and take over? And there is a danger of that, right? Because you cannot copyright early delivery or healthy sourcing from the farms, right? So that may happen, but whatever happens as far as the consumers are concerned, there's some benefit to be found because people started to think differently about the way they want to do. So it's differentiation.
I absolutely, completely agree. And I think the fact that they're building up that moat of differentiation, so you talked about even logistically, like running that has got to be quite a lot of process to set that up. So even if you're a big company, yes, you take some time, but that still allows you a bit of buffer time. But I also really what you said about focusing on one specific thing. So you mentioned the Curly example of people are frustrated about the windows for delivery. So if you focus on just that one aspect where people are frustrated or fed up with, and then find a way to fix that or alleviate that, that could be a way to differentiation. Because when people talk about differentiation, they think, oh, I have to do a completely different business. And I thought that same way as well, too. I have to be completely different. I got to try something that's off the wall. But to your point, focusing on just one, just in this element, one specific thing that really upsets the customer, and then finding a way to fix it is a great way to differentiate. So I love that example.
Okay, yeah. It's not always kind of rocket science by thinking, oh, how can I invent the next Amazon or the next Google or something? Sometimes it's just taking something and just look at your own experience or talk to people and ask them, what is your experience? Because that's where relevance comes from, right? It's just from observation, from asking people, from doing a little bit of research, and then finding a solution that would address maybe a small but significant pain point that people may have.
Absolutely. Now, Jörg, I know you've spoken with so many folks during this book. What is one thing that surprised you? Because I know you've been, as you said, working for several years in consulting and then MNCs and now teaching. What is one thing that really surprised you when you were writing this book?
What surprised me is that really, because position this in Asia, right? So three assumptions. One is next, as in not so big yet. In the meantime, some have grown quite big. So VinFast, producing e-mobility out of Vietnam, they have become quite big and they're opening a factory in the US and all of that. But when we started, they weren't so big. So that was the first one. The second one is Asia. And the third one is post-pandemic, right? The big surprise was that, and a great learning, especially for the big brands that we all know, is that the exclusive club that used to exist doesn't exist anymore. So it's basically open play for anybody. The barriers may still be there to enter a specific segment, but it's not impossible to do it because of digitization, because of scaling and all of that. And because Asia is a really good area to be in, because you can try new things and people are prepared to also try things with you, give you the benefit of the doubt. So VinFast, I mentioned, what's so special about them? It's just the fact that e-mobility comes out of Vietnam and not out of Munich and not out of Detroit and not out of the places where you would expect it to be. And suddenly that's possible. And suddenly they can get funding because there's a lot of money around. If you have a great idea, they can get funding and they can set up something where you didn't think it was possible. Of course, it was different for Tesla, but they opened the kind of category. But after that, you just have the big names or brands that are connected to those big names from Polestar, from China, whoever, who are active in this field. So I thought that was an interesting learning that suddenly, in a way, we've leveled the playing field. And that's what you want to see when you look at emerging brands, right? Because if it's only the big players, and you can only think about what the conglomerates are doing next, who tend to be quite conservative and tend to do focus groups and tests and everything before they do anything. I think it's quite encouraging to see brands starting small, but really changing the industry or inventing an industry like Kenobi Tech. So they just realized, look, there is a gap between you finish university and then what's next, right? You find a job. How does that work? Because university doesn't really empower you to do the right thing to find the job, right? Which university teaches you to write a CV, right? Nobody does, because it's assumed that, I don't know what they think. So for a while, it was maybe a little bit easier. You did your internship with a bank or with some big marketing organization, and then they liked you, they asked you to come back. But more and more people, especially in more emerging markets like Indonesia, they're doing really well in Indonesia. Everybody's interested in this software, and they're signing up with universities to help people bridge the gap and go online and learn the tools. And I also think that has something to do with the generational way of life, if you want, because when I applied for my first job, I sat in my room, I had a typewriter, I guess electric already, and I typed out my CV and I sent it off, right? That was it. And then I waited until the phone rang downstairs, right? So now I think that's very different. And more we're used to going online and finding solutions there. And I think that's good for brands who come up with ideas, because they don't need to be everywhere. They just need to position themselves out on LinkedIn, wherever, and say, look, here's an opportunity for you to learn, pick up some of the tools. Maybe here is even some software that can help you write something or prepare for an interview, and off you go. So you're not alone with it. And I think that's something we will see more and more in many different industries.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we're talking about, like differentiation is like, in this case, bridging the gap. You talked about the gap between you graduate and then you're trying to get a job. Many of my students are trying to figure out, okay, what do I do next? So if you have something that can bridge the gap, then it can obviously help the universities and help the students. Then being that middleman or that middle tech is actually a pretty good position to be in.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that I was maybe not surprised to find, but it reminded me like, yeah, this is what I would have seen in a few other aspects. And this is how my students, and you're also teaching. So my students are undergrad. So they're like, the girls are 20, the guys are 22. And this is how they live their life. Right? And that also means if for some reason the phone breaks, they're completely helpless, cannot find a place, don't know how to use a map and all of that. But the expectation is there that I have this tool and I can access it everywhere I am, and it can help me in pretty much every situation in my life. So if brands realize that and then match it with an offer, I think there's a lot of potential in that.
Absolutely. I know this book is just out, but are there any other, have you start thinking about the next book? Has that started popping in your head? Because I know you have a succession of books.
You know, what's funny is I never really planned the books. The first one was because I couldn't find a textbook that I liked, because they were all American and they were all some of the brands I hadn't even heard of. So I wrote my own with Asian examples called Create, Connect, Convince. And so the publisher put a bottle on the cover saying 3-in-1. And then my students started calling it the shampoo book. So it started with the shampoo book. And then I wrote one with a student together about how to make money from your hobby, then experience economy, and now this one. What happened since very recently, since I've started talking about the book or explaining it to people, come to me and say, can we be in your next book? Can we be in the next big Asian brands too? Because we have an interesting brand. And even yesterday, I was having lunch with a company, and they are a headhunting company, and their focus is on Asia. So they're competing with all those international names. And so they said, what do we do with it? And I said, view it as a positive, right? View it as a kind of, we know Asia better than anybody else. Yes, we cannot do New York and we cannot do Frankfurt, but if you want to do Taipei or Beijing or Kuala Lumpur or Singapore, we can help you with that because we are local, we speak the language, we're all Asian. Sometimes you need to look for that angle, and I've had quite a few who've come to me, and obviously that cannot be the only criteria for gathering the brands for the next book, but let's see.
Yeah, I think that makes it so much easier writing, like you said, because finding it, that list is hard enough. We have people coming to you, they filter out. So awesome. I'm really looking forward to the next book. For everyone, definitely check out the next big Asian brands. Where is it available? Where can folks get it?
Pretty much if you're in most countries in Asia, in local bookstores, but you can also get it online. You can get it from Kinokuniya online, Amazon, depending on which Amazon you're on, may take a little bit longer because they have a different kind of cycle, but yeah, pretty much everywhere. Or just walk into your next bookstore and ask for it and insist that they order it.
And so thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all your insights with us. I found it super valuable. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And for everyone watching and listening to today's episode, you got to go to your local bookstore, make sure they have a copy, insist on it. And we really appreciate the support. We'll see you on the next episode, guys.